Welcome to Too Fond of Books. My name is Janelle, and in this video I'm going to be sharing the 4 books that I read for the Nightingale Seacole Challenge, the Nightingale Seacole September Challenge, I believe is how it's called, which is a continuation of the Nightingale August Challenge. I've really been enjoying these challenges and reading more about Florence Nightingale and nursing and some of the history. Because I really didn't know a whole lot about the Crimean War or about Florence Nightingale, to be honest. And so it's been really very interesting. And so the one that I finished was Florence Nightingale by Cecil Woodham Smith. This is a huge biography of the life of Florence Nightingale. And it was really interesting. I mean, she's got quite the family, first of all, but her dedication to discovering what it is that she's been called to do with her life and the commitment that she gave to that was really very interesting and inspiring. There were some things that I didn't realize. I mean, I know that she kind of pioneered nursing, modern day nursing, but she was really into statistics, and she did a lot of gathering statistics, visiting hospitals, gathering statistics, and kind of laying out in a logical, rational manner what the needs really were. And so I thought that was really very interesting. And she was also far more interested in army reform than I realized. And so that part was really interesting too. There's a few tabs in here, so we'll just get right into that. Oh, first of all, this copy is from the library, and I saw this little card tucked in the front, and it says, "This volume has been donated to Saskatchewan Libraries by Susan Tweedsmuir. Susan Lady Tweedsmuir, Burford, Oxfordshire, England, July 1968. So that's cool. And this book was first published in 1950, but this edition is 1968. All right, so let's get into some of these tabs. Sidney Herbert, he was the secretary at war or of war or something like that, and he and his wife were really good friends with Florence Nightingale, and he wrote her a letter asking her to take some nurses out to Crimea during the war. And he writes in this letter, "If this succeeds, an enormous amount of good will be done now, and to persons deserving everything at our hands, and a prejudice will have been broken through, and a precedent established which will multiply the good to all time." I thought that was really interesting because it was totally true, wasn't it? And then this description of what it was like in Crimea and the state, I guess the state of the British Army. "There were men in the Crimea, there were men in Scutari, there were men at home in England who saw the tragedy approach. They were powerless. The system under which the health of the British Army was administered defeated them. The exactions, the imbecilities of the system killed energy and efficiency, crushed initiative, removed responsibility, and were the death of common sense." So that's very interesting. And really, so much of what Florence Nightingale did in the Crimea was fight to fix the structure of the army, specifically the hospitals, when she was out there, because everyone was just being crushed under bureaucracy. 3 departments were responsible for maintaining the health of the British Army and for the organization of its hospitals: the commissariat, the purveyor's department, and the medical department. And the fight that she had to get any of those to work together for the health of the soldiers was unbelievable. Here's a description of Scutari. "The filth became indescribable. The men in the corridors lay on unwashed, rotten floors, crawling with vermin. As the Reverend Sidney Godolphin Osborne knelt to take down dying messages, his paper became covered thickly with lice. There were no pillows, no blankets. The men lay with their heads on their boots, wrapped in a blanket or greatcoat, stiff with blood and filth, which had been their sole covering perhaps for more than a week. There were no screens or operating tables. Amputations had to be performed in the wards in full view of the patients. Mr. Osborne describes the amputation of a thigh, quote, "done upon boards put on 2 trestles. I assisted during the latter part of the operation. The man's position became such from want of a table he was supported by my arm underneath, a surgeon on the other side grasping my wrist." End quote. One of Miss Nightingale's first acts was to procure a screen from Constantinople so that men might be spared the sight of the suffering they themselves were doomed to undergo. Fate had worse in store. On the night of November 14th, it was noticed that the sea in the Bosphorus was running abnormally high and there was a strange thrumming wind. Within a few days, news came that the Crimea had been devastated by the worst hurricane within the memory of man. Tents were reduced to shreds, horses blown helplessly for miles, buildings destroyed, trees uprooted. The marquees which formed the regimental field hospitals vanished, and men were left half buried in mud without coverings of any kind. Most serious of all, every vessel in Balaclava harbor was destroyed, among them a large ship, the Prince, which had entered the harbor the previous day loaded with warm winter clothing and stores for the troops. By the end of November, the administration of the hospital had collapsed. The commissariat department was the first to break down. No proper accounts had been kept since the first influx of the sick and wounded from Alma, and the disasters of the hurricane and the loss of the Prince overwhelmed it, and the purveyor was rendered helpless by the collapse of the commissariat. Medical direction of the hospital had almost ceased to exist, assisted by an inexplicable action on the part of the government. It had been decided that Dr. Menzies was incompetent and should be recalled. The officer chosen to succeed him was Dr. Cumming, but Dr. Cumming was one of the 3 members of the hospital's commission, and when he arrived in Scutari, neither he nor Dr. Menzies knew how to proceed accordingly. Dr. Menzies stated that he was not aware what his duties should be because he had been superseded by Dr. Cumming. Dr. Cumming did not feel he could take control and issue orders in a hospital on which he was supposed to be making a report. Through a further piece of ill luck, Dr. Spence, the second doctor on the hospital's commission, was drowned in the Prince, and the work of the commission was held up 3 weeks. Meanwhile, Dr. Menzies and Dr. Cumming each refrained from giving orders so that the hospital was left without direction. By the spring of 1855, she was physically exhausted. She was a slight woman who had never been robust, was accustomed to luxury, and was now living in almost unendurable hardship. When it rained, water poured through the roof of her quarters and dripped through the floor on an officer beneath, who complained that, quote, Miss Nightingale was pouring water on his head, unquote. The food was uneatable, though allowance of water was still 1 pint a head a day. The building was vermin infested, the atmosphere in the hospital so foul that to visit the wards produced diarrhea. She never went out except to hurry over the 1/4 of a mile of refuse-strewn mud which separated the barrack from the general hospital. I mean, these conditions are just unbelievable. But then this is interesting. One of the nurses described accompanying her on her rounds, quote, "It seemed an endless walk and one not easily forgotten. As we slowly passed along, the silence was profound. Very seldom did a moan or cry from those deeply suffering fall on our ears. A dim light burned here and there. Miss Nightingale carried her lantern, which she would set down before she bent over any of the patients. I much admired her manner to the men. It was so tender and kind." So I wonder if something out of that is where we got our the title, The Lady of the Lamp. All right, so years later, she wrote a few things, one of which was notes on matters affecting the health, efficiency, and hospital administration of the British Army, notes on hospitals, notes on nursing, suggestions for thought. And in her notes on hospitals, this was the thought that Cecil Woodham Smith had. It was her revolutionary thesis that the high rate of mortality, then invariable in large hospitals, was preventable and unnecessary. Hospitals showed their appallingly high death rate because they flouted the elementary principles of sanitary science. The answer to hospital mortality was neither prayer nor self-sacrifice, but better ventilation, a higher standard of cleanliness, better drainage, and better food. Floors and walls and bedsteads which could be scrubbed, windows and corridors placed to carry away foul air, proper heating, and a larger cubic allowance of air per patient would bring the rate of mortality down. I think it's so interesting that the things that she wrote about seem so obvious to us now, 150 years on, and yet at the time it was revolutionary. Better ventilation, clean the areas, clean the patient. I mean, this stuff was revolutionary. It's so fascinating. All right, and then finally, in May 1860, advertisements appeared inviting applications for admission. The response was discouraging. However, 15 candidates were chosen, and on July the 9th, 1860, the Nightingale School opened. No pupil was admitted without a certificate of good character, and the training was to last for 1 year. So long a period was hitherto unheard of. The Nightingale probationers lived in a nurse's home. This was a novel idea originated by Miss Nightingale, and it was received with disapproval by the opposition. An upper floor of a wing of St. Thomas's was fitted up so that each probationer had a bedroom to herself. There was a common sitting room, and the sister in charge had a bedroom and sitting room of her own. So I think it's very interesting that despite the fact that they didn't get a whole ton of applicants, they started their first year with 15 candidates for the first year of her Nightingale training school for nurses when it opened. So yeah, it was an eye-opening read for me for sure. And then I went on to read what she wrote herself, Notes on Nursing. I read this on my Kindle. And at first I didn't quite get what this was about, but then I realized that she wasn't necessarily writing this to train actual nurses, but more just for women who were taking care of people in their own homes, more like that kind of person. But then there was something in the biography that I read that I found really helpful for understanding what she wrote. So she was writing Notes on Nursing, what it is and what it is not. And in the biography, I read this. Notes on Nursing was intended to make the millions of women who had charge of the health of their children and their households, quote, think how to nurse. It was, she wrote, by no means intended as a manual to teach nurses to nurse. It is a book of great charm, sympathetic, sensible, intimate, full of witty and pungent sayings, and possessing a formidable freshness. Quote, it is as fresh as if nobody had ever before spoken of nursing, wrote Harriet Martineau, and Sidney Herbert wrote in January 1860 that it was, quote, more interesting than a novel, unquote. Neither its good sense nor its wit has dated, and Notes on Nursing can be read today with enjoyment. I'm not sure that I read it with enjoyment, but it was very interesting, and it was really mostly all about ventilation and cleaning. And at first, to me, that seemed so obvious, but I realized, especially after reading the biography, that at the time that was so revolutionary. And so I'm glad that I read it, and I'm glad that I read the biography. And then I read the second in the Florence Nightingale mystery series by Christine Trent. I read the first one in August. This was called Murderous, Malady. And this takes place in London in 1854, towards the end of the summer, when cholera breaks out in London. And Florence Nightingale is asked by the Middlesex Hospital to bring some nurses and to help them deal with the influx of patients who have come in because of cholera. Meanwhile, her friend Elizabeth Herbert, wife of Sidney Herbert, is attacked in her carriage, and their driver is killed. And Sidney asks Florence to look into it. So she's trying to figure out what's going on with that, as well as getting her nurses organized to go and help at the Middlesex Hospital with the cholera outbreak. So it was a good mystery. Again, I always enjoy Christine Trent is great, and so it's a good historical mystery. And I didn't guess who the killer was, but I found the historical bits really fascinating. So the bits about cholera and people's understanding of cholera and how it is passed. There was a lot of that in here, which was really interesting. And the state of the hospital when they had all this influx of the cholera patients, that was really interesting too. So I can totally recommend this series. If you enjoy history, if you enjoy historical mysteries, this could be the series for you. It was really quite enjoyable. And then I also read Call the Nurse, True Stories of a Country Nurse on a Scottish Isle by Mary MacLeod. This was fascinating. This is her memoir of the years that she spent on an island in the Hebrides. Her and her family had lived in England, and they moved up to this island on the Hebrides, and she became basically the district nurse. And so these were just stories of her experiences as a district nurse on the island in the early 70s. I think it was 1970. This book was 1970, 1971. And so some of the stuff was just really, really fascinating. She was a really good writer. Like, I thought it came across really well, and just fascinating stories of what it was like to live on such a remote island. And I thought that she wrote with a lot of respect for the people who lived there. There was definite tragedy and heartbreak, but there were also some pretty funny things too. I can highly recommend this if you're looking for true stories of what it's like for nurses in specific situations. This could be the book for you. And I tabbed just a couple of things in here. Oh, I found this fascinating. So remember, this is 1970. As the district nurse, I had the only phone other than the post office in the village. She didn't have the only phone on the island, but her and the post office were the only phone in the village, and their village was even still remote from other villages on the island because of mountains and locks and all kinds of stuff made it really difficult to travel. So I thought that was really interesting that in 1970 there was only 2 telephones in their village. And there was somebody, she got called to go help in a cottage, a croft, and the postman from the Royal Mail only came twice a week to that croft, and he was the person who lived there. Her name was Annie. He was her only contact with the outside world. And so just like understanding just how remote some of these crofts were, and the trouble that could cause, or the difficulties that could cause was so interesting. So I can highly recommend Call the Nurse. It was really, really interesting. So those are the books that I read for Nightingale Seacole September. I'm really glad that I was part of this challenge. Have you read any of these books? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below, and I will see you for another video soon.